A lone bulb burned above Captain President Ibrahim Traoré as midnight thunder cracked over Ouagadougou. His desk, littered with satellite photos, casualty maps, and half-drunk Ataya, had become a battlefield of paper. The latest dossier warned that insurgents were regrouping near the Guinean border. Every red circle on the map felt like a pulse of looming danger. While he annotated troop movement charts, the heavy teak doors creaked. Marie Caboret, his chief aide, stepped inside, posture rigid, face drained of color. In her outstretched hands rested a cream envelope sealed with the embossed crest of the Domestic Intelligence Directorate. Traoré read her eyes before her lips moved. Something unprecedented had just breached the palace walls. Monsieur le Président, this arrived moments ago, director-level dispatch, eyes only. Her voice barely rose above the monsoon rain rattling the shutters. Traoré's instinct, honed in foxholes and coup chambers, told him bad news always travels in thin envelopes. He slit the seal with the tip of his tactical knife. Inside lay a single-sheet briefing stamped code crimson. The header, imminent unconstitutional action, made his pulse thump. Names and call signs lined the page, but one word froze him: Diallo, Amadou. For a heartbeat the room seemed to tilt. Amadou was more than a trusted official, he was the barefoot boy who had shared powdered milk lunches with Ibrahim in Bandouku's sandstone alleys. Traoré's jaw tightened. A betrayal of this magnitude could unravel fragile national cohesion overnight. Yet shock quickly congealed into focus. Decisions made in the next few hours would define whether Burkina Faso woke to civil chaos or emerging stability. He folded the sheet carefully, dismissing Marie with a curt nod. When the doors shut, Traoré exhaled once, steady and controlled, soldier's breath before the breach. Whatever happened next, he would grasp the nettle himself, not delegate destiny to someone else's trigger finger. Amadou Diallo's name glared up from the dossier like a flare in night vision. Childhood confidant, campus roommate, guerrilla radio co-founder, now accessioned under, primary co-conspirator. The file alleged he had brokered meetings with disgruntled colonels, promising swift regime change and a people-centered Salvation Council. Evidence included wiretapped calls, encrypted text chains, and a bank transfer from a mining syndicate desperate to restore business as usual. Traoré felt an almost physical ache, the memory of two teenagers sleeping on the same straw mat, plotting to liberate their homeland from kleptocrats. After the 2022 putsch, he had rewarded Amadou's idealism with a cabinet seat overseeing rural reconstruction, a portfolio meant to channel their youthful dreams into asphalt, seed banks, and clinics. Now those dreams lay ruptured. Marie re-entered with the counterinsurgency chief and General Lassina Kabor. Kabor's first words were pure doctrine: we mobilize the Praetorian Guards, seal city exits, detain Diallo before sunrise. Traoré raised a hand. No, the syllable landed like a gavel. No midnight dragnets. I will go to Bobo Dioulasso alone. The general's eyes widened. Sir, that town could be crawling with hostiles. Traoré's reply was ice calm: if the bond we forged in poverty is truly broken, bullets will not mend it. And if it is not broken, one misplaced round could destroy the nation's best hope for reconciliation. Kabor argued doctrine: coup plots demand decisive force, but doctrine, Traoré countered, rarely accounts for the moral optics of gunning down a brother. He ordered a single, unmarked SUV prepped with no escort. Marie tried a final appeal: at least let me send a tracker unit. Traoré's shake of the head was gentle yet final. Intelligence must meet conscience face to face. Before departure he penned a 3-line directive: if I fail to report by 0600, enact contingency horizon shield, arrest all named actors, broadcast constitutional address, safeguard civilian ministries. Signing it, he realized the paper might sanction the capture of Amadou, or himself, by dawn. As the palace gates swung open, warm rain slicked the tarmac. The capital's streetlights flickered under monsoon gusts, mirroring the uncertainty that now cloaked the republic. Yet inside the driver's seat, Ibrahim Traoré found a grim clarity: leadership is not only strategic calculus, at times it is the willingness to bear personal heartbreak so that an entire people might be spared collective trauma. With headlights slicing the storm, he turned westward toward the city where friendship had birthed revolution, and where it might now be asked to bury betrayal. As Traoré stood in the modest room, the tension between him and Amadou Diallo was palpable. The memories of their shared youth. Long nights spent discussing dreams of a free and prosperous Burkina Faso, felt distant now. Amadou, his childhood friend, was the man who had once stood beside him in the fight for a better future, yet now he was part of the plot that threatened to unravel everything they had worked for. Amadou, visibly uncomfortable, finally invited Traoré to sit down. He closed the door behind them, and the two men sat across from each other. The room was simple, no luxuries, just basic furniture and some photographs on the walls, including one of the two of them in their youth, reminder of their past bond. "You know why I'm doing this," Amadou said quietly, his voice strained with emotion. He looked down at his hands, avoiding Traoré's gaze. "Our people are suffering, Ibrahim. You're so busy trying to save the country that you've forgotten to listen to the people." Traoré's heart sank as the words hit him. Amadou's frustration was clear, but Traoré could not reconcile the man who had once shared his vision of progress with the person who now sought to destroy it. He leaned forward, trying to steady his own emotions. "I never forgot the people, Amadou. I grew up among them, just like you. But overthrowing the government won't solve our problems. It will only create more chaos." Amadou's eyes darted away as if grappling with his inner conflict. He was torn between his conviction that the people's pain had to be addressed, and the loyalty he still felt toward his old friend. His voice trembled. "I just wanted to help, but no one listens to me, Ibrahim. Not even you." The weight of those words struck Traoré deeply. His friend, a man he once trusted completely, had come to believe that only radical action could bring about change. But Traoré knew better. He had fought hard to get where he was, not to destroy everything in a single, misguided act. Traoré placed a hand on Amadou's shoulder, the gesture meant to comfort, yet it felt like a plea. "If you want to help, then stand by me. Together, we can do more than any uprising could." For a moment, the room fell silent. Amadou's tears began to fall freely now, his face a mixture of regret and shame. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice cracking. "But can I still fix this?" Traoré nodded slowly, his voice calm but filled with understanding. "Yes, my brother. We all make mistakes. The important thing is what we do after we recognize them." The weight of the situation was not lost on either man. The path ahead would not be easy, but it was a path toward healing rather than destruction. Traoré saw in Amadou a man who had been lost, but who was now ready to find his way back. And as Traoré looked into his friend's eyes, he realized that this was not just a moment of personal reckoning, but a crucial turning point for Burkina Faso. If he could show mercy to his childhood friend, perhaps the country could learn to forgive itself as well. After the emotional conversation, Traoré left Amadou's house, the lingering question of what to do with his friend's future still weighing heavily on him. The decision would not be easy, but one thing was clear: this was a test not just of leadership, but of heart. The journey to Bobo Dioulasso was quieter than he had anticipated. The usual frenetic pace of the city, the constant hum of activity, was absent in the stillness of the road. Traoré drove alone, the engine's hum punctuated by the occasional patter of rain hitting the windshield. His mind raced, sifting through the past, his days with Amadou Diallo, the bond that had been formed in the small, dusty streets of their youth in Banduku. It was a time before politics, before betrayal, when the world seemed a place of endless possibility. They had shared dreams of a better Burkina Faso, a vision of progress that would bring prosperity and equality. Amadou had been by his side through thick and thin. They had fought side by side in the revolution, believing in the same ideals: fairness, justice, and the hope that their nation could rise above its colonial past. Amadou, with his quiet wisdom and determination, had been the brother Ibrahim never had. Now, as he drove toward the city where Amadou had allegedly become a part of the plot to undermine the very system they had worked to build, Traoré felt a pang in his chest. How could this be the same man who had once shared his vision of a free and just Burkina Faso? The weather worsened as he drove, a reflection of the turmoil he felt inside. It was as if the storm outside matched the storm brewing within him. He had always prided himself on being a man of integrity, someone who could make difficult decisions for the greater good, but this situation, this betrayal, was unlike any other he had faced. He had always been the one to fight for justice, to protect the people. But now, it seemed, the very man he had trusted most had turned against him. As he approached the outskirts of Bobo Dioulasso, Traoré steeled himself. He had to be prepared for anything. The intelligence report had suggested that Amadou was working with a group of high-ranking military officers and businessmen, all of them conspiring to take down the government. The plan was elaborate, well-organized, and dangerous. But Traoré refused to let fear take hold of him. He could not let the weight of this betrayal paralyze him. Instead, he had to confront it head-on. When he reached the small house on the outskirts of the city, the rain had slowed to a light drizzle. The house was modest, tucked away behind a high wall, with a small garden in front. It was nothing like the grand government buildings Traoré was used to, but it was enough for someone who wanted to keep a low profile. He knocked on the door, his heart beating louder in his chest than he cared to admit. The door opened slowly, and there stood Amadou, dressed simply in worn clothes, his face a mask of surprise and confusion. His eyes, once so full of ambition and determination, now seemed clouded with uncertainty. "Ibrahim," Amadou said, his voice thick with emotion. "What are you doing here?" Traoré stared at his old friend for a long moment, the weight of the betrayal heavy in the air between them. "I could ask you the same, my brother." "Why are you doing this?" he replied, his voice steady but laced with the pain he was trying desperately to suppress. Amadou hesitated, visibly uncomfortable. After a long pause, he stepped aside and gestured for Traoré to enter. As the door closed behind them, the room was revealed to be sparsely furnished, with just a few pieces of old furniture and photographs on the walls. The walls seemed to echo with the memories of their youth, a time when they had dreamed together of a better future. "You know why I'm doing this," Amadou said, sitting down on a worn chair. His voice was heavy with resignation. "Our people are suffering, Ibrahim. You're so busy trying to save the country that you've forgotten to listen to the people." Traoré's heart sank. He had never stopped listening to the people. That was why he had fought so hard to take power in the first place, to change the system, to create a better future for them all. But now, as he sat across from Amadou, it seemed as though everything he had worked for was unraveling in front of him. How could his closest ally, the one person he trusted more than anyone else, be part of the very forces trying to tear the country apart? "I never forgot the people, Amadou," Traoré said, his voice tight with frustration. "I grew up among them, just like you. But overthrowing the government won't solve our problems. It will only create more chaos." Amadou lowered his eyes, clearly torn between his convictions and the friendship he still felt for Traoré. "I just wanted to help," he murmured. "But no one listens to me. Not even you." Traoré stood and walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "If you want to help, then stand by me. Together, we can do more than any uprising could." For a moment, there was silence. Amadou seemed to be weighing his words, his face a mixture of sorrow and uncertainty. As tears began to stream down his face, he finally spoke. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice breaking. "But can I still fix this?" Traoré nodded, his voice soft but firm. "Yes, my brother. We all make mistakes. The important thing is what we do after we recognize them." The decision was made. Traoré returned to the presidential palace in Ouagadougou, his mind swirling with thoughts of the conversation he had just had with Amadou. Despite the weight of the betrayal, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. The old bond between them had not been completely broken. Amadou had confessed, and now it was up to Traoré to decide what to do with that confession. He knew the path forward would not be easy. When he entered the meeting room, the generals and ministers were waiting anxiously. The tension was palpable. They all knew something significant had transpired, but none of them knew the details. General Kabor broke the silence, his voice low with concern. "Mr. President," he said, his eyes flicking nervously toward the others. "What happened there? Should we arrest the conspirators?" Traoré took a deep breath, his chest tight with emotion. He had already made his decision, but he knew that delivering it would not be easy. Amadou confessed his involvement in the plan, he said, his voice firm but thick with emotion. But he did not act out of personal ambition. He believed he was helping our people. The room fell silent, the gravity of the revelation sinking in. Many of the ministers and generals had expected harsh punishment for the coup plotters, but Traoré seemed to be taking a different approach. They had always known him as a man of conviction, but now he was showing a different side, a leader willing to forgive, to build rather than destroy. The next day, Ibrahim Traoré called an emergency meeting with his cabinet to discuss the next steps. The air was thick with anticipation as his ministers and generals gathered in the sleek, sterile conference room. Their faces were a mixture of concern, skepticism, and quiet admiration, but none of them could deny that the country was on the brink of something pivotal. Amadou's betrayal had shaken the foundation of the government, but Traoré had handled it with remarkable grace, choosing forgiveness over retribution. Traoré's voice was firm as he addressed the room. "Gentlemen," he said, looking directly at his ministers and generals, "we cannot allow the ambition of the few to compromise the future of the many." His words were powerful, resonating with a quiet authority that demanded attention. There was a noticeable shift in the room as his words sank in. Burkina Faso's future was indeed at a crossroads, and the path they chose now would shape the country for years to come. "Today," Traoré continued, "we will act firmly, but also justly." The generals nodded, ready to carry out their orders. They had seen the wisdom in Traoré's decision with Amadou and now stood ready to follow his lead. Traoré was a man who led not just with strategy, but with empathy. His decision to show mercy to Amadou had been a gamble, but one that had paid off in the long run. Now, it was time to move forward with the security of the country in mind. He then detailed the plan. The coup plotters would be arrested and put on trial, but those who showed genuine repentance would be given the opportunity for redemption, just like Amadou. It was a move that would likely raise eyebrows in the political world, but it was a testament to Traoré's belief in second chances and the power of personal transformation. His decision was not just about punishing the guilty, it was about forging a future where the mistakes of the past could be reconciled. After the meeting, Traoré made the decision to visit some of the rural communities that had been most affected by political instability. He wanted to hear directly from the people, to understand how they were coping with the unrest and how they viewed the current government. It was important for him to connect with his people, to reaffirm his commitment to their well-being. In a small village to the north of Ouagadougou, Traoré met Fatou, a woman who had lost her husband in a previous conflict. She held a faded photo of him as she spoke to the president, her voice thick with emotion. "Mr. President," she said, "I just want my children to grow up in peace. We don't need riches, just security." Her words were simple, yet powerful, and they struck a deep chord in Traoré's heart. He placed a hand on her shoulder, deeply moved by the sincerity of her plea. "You have my word, Fatou," he said. "We will do everything we can to ensure your children have the future they deserve." As Traoré left the village, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He understood now more than ever that true leadership was not just about policy or power, it was about listening to the people, understanding their pain, and acting with compassion to bring about real change. The next chapter in Traoré's journey was one of personal reflection and national transformation. In the weeks following his visit to the rural villages, he felt the weight of his decisions more than ever. His actions in dealing with Amadou Diallo and the plotters had sent shockwaves through the political system, but it was not without consequence. Some of his ministers were still wary of the mercy he had shown, fearing it would embolden future dissenters. But Traoré stood firm in his belief that leadership was not about striking down those who made mistakes, it was about lifting them up and guiding them toward redemption. As Traoré moved forward, he continued to meet with his people, visiting communities that had been hardest hit by the conflict. These visits, often unannounced, allowed him to speak directly with those who had the most at stake in the government's success. His message was simple: Burkina Faso was rebuilding, but it would only succeed if every citizen played a role in that process. His presence in these villages, where the pain of the past still lingered, was a reminder that leadership was not just about policies, it was about people. One particularly moving experience occurred when Traoré visited the Innovation Center in a small village on the outskirts of Ouagadougou. The center had been set up to help local farmers learn new, more sustainable farming techniques. As Traoré walked through the center, he saw the fruits of his government's efforts in action. Farmers who had once struggled to grow enough to feed their families were now thriving, thanks to the knowledge and resources provided by the center. It was here that Fatou, the woman he had met in the village, spoke to him again. She had been working with the center, learning about new agricultural techniques, and her face was bright with pride. "Mr. President," she said, "this is what we need. This is how we can build a better future for our children." Traoré smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. He knew that the road ahead was still long and fraught with challenges, but moments like these, the tangible change in the lives of ordinary Burkinabe, reminded him of the power of leadership that prioritized human connection over political gain. As he walked away from the Innovation Center, Traoré thought about Amadou, about the decision he had made, and about the future. He had shown mercy, but he also knew that the work wasn't done. There were still obstacles to overcome, still injustices to address. But the seeds had been planted. The work of transformation had begun, not just for the country, but for the people. And as long as he continued to lead with empathy and understanding, there was hope for a brighter future for all. In the days that followed, Traoré found himself more entrenched in his leadership role than ever before. His visit to the Innovation Center had marked a turning point, but it also underscored how much more needed to be done. The country was still reeling from the effects of years of political instability, and the demands on his leadership were greater than ever. He knew that every decision he made would be scrutinized, not just by his enemies, but by those who had placed their trust in him. The coup plot had been quelled, but the underlying tensions remained. There were still factions within the government that resented his approach to leadership, and many of the people who had once supported him were now questioning whether his choices were too lenient. The decision to spare Amadou and give him a second chance had sparked mixed reactions. Some saw it as an act of mercy, while others saw it as a sign of weakness. Traoré spent countless hours in meetings with his generals and ministers, trying to balance the needs of the government with the desires of the people. He knew that trust in leadership was fragile, and that any misstep could cause the foundation of his presidency to crumble. But he also understood that leadership was not about pleasing everyone, it was about doing what was right, even when it was difficult. He continued to visit villages and communities across the country, meeting with citizens face-to-face and listening to their concerns. These moments of connection, these honest conversations with ordinary people, reinforced his belief that his leadership had to be grounded in empathy. True leadership, he knew, came from understanding the struggles of the people and making decisions that reflected their needs. One day, during one of his visits to a rural village, he met a young boy named Mamadou who had received a school uniform and supplies through the resources generated by land reform. The boy's face lit up as he handed Traoré a small note. "This is for you," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. The note read, "When we are given the right tools, we can conquer the world." Traoré felt deeply moved by the child's words, knowing that his government's efforts were starting to make a real difference. As he looked at the child, Traoré realized that the road to true transformation would be long and difficult, but the change was already happening. People like Mamadou were proof that even the smallest actions could create big changes. And with that realization, Traoré felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was no longer just a president, he was a leader on a mission to build a better future for every citizen of Burkina Faso. I've known him since I was a child, Traoré continued, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. He was one of the first to believe in me when I dreamed of changing this country. I can't just dismiss him as an enemy. The Minister of Justice, a sharp woman with a reputation for pragmatism, intervened. Mr. President, she said, her voice cautious, this could be seen as weakness. If you spare Amadou, others may interpret this as an opening for future betrayal. Traoré nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. I understand your concerns, he said. But we also need to remember that leadership is not just about punishing. It's about righting wrongs and building bridges. His decision was made, Amadou would be removed from his government position, but instead of punishment, Traoré would send him to work directly with rural communities, where his skills could be put to use in a more positive way. The decision was met with a mix of approval and skepticism. Some ministers applauded Traoré's compassionate approach, while others feared the political consequences. They worried that this decision might send the wrong message, but Traoré was resolute. His conscience told him that this was the right thing to do. It wasn't about politics, it was about healing a wound that ran deeper than any political struggle. The room in the presidential palace was heavy with tension when Traoré entered. Generals and ministers were seated around the long conference table, their faces a mix of concern and curiosity. They knew something personal had transpired between the president and his childhood friend, Amadou, in Bobo Dioulasso, but none of them had any idea what had happened behind those closed doors. General Kabor was the first to break the silence, his voice calm but full of the authority that came with years of military service. Mr. President, he began, looking directly at Traoré, what happened there? Should we arrest the conspirators? Traoré paused for a moment, letting the question hang in the air. He could feel the eyes of his cabinet on him, waiting for an answer. This was the moment where his decision would either unify the government or tear it apart. The room was filled with expectations, but he could not act out of political convenience. The situation with Amadou was not one that could be rushed. It had to be handled with care, but also with firmness. He exhaled deeply, then spoke, his voice steady but thick with emotion. Amadou confessed his involvement in the plan, Traoré said, his words carrying a heavy weight. But he did not act out of personal ambition. He believed he was helping our people. He thought his actions were in service of the greater good. The room fell silent. It was clear that no one had expected this response. Many of the generals and ministers had assumed that Amadou would be arrested immediately, that he would be treated like any other conspirator. But Traoré was not like other leaders. His understanding of loyalty, forgiveness, and justice ran deeper than the cold calculations of power. He wasn't just leading Burkina Faso as its president, he was trying to lead with the heart of a nation that had suffered for too long under corrupt rule. I've known him since I was a child, Traoré continued, his eyes meeting those of his ministers. He was one of the first to believe in me when I dreamed of changing this country. I can't just dismiss him as an enemy. The Minister of Justice, a stern woman who had always advocated for strong, decisive action, spoke up, her concern evident. Mr. President, this could be seen as weakness, she said, her voice carrying a note of warning. If you spare Amadou, others may interpret this as an opening for future betrayal. Traoré nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. He knew that the decision he was making could have far-reaching consequences, both for his leadership and for the country. Would his decision to show mercy be interpreted as a sign of weakness or strength? The risks of such an approach were not lost on him. But he also knew that leadership was not just about punishing mistakes, it was about correcting them, building bridges, and offering redemption. I understand your concerns, Traoré said quietly, his gaze sweeping the room. But we also need to remember that leadership is not just about punishing. It's about righting wrongs and building bridges. The decision was made. Amadou would not be executed or thrown into prison. He would be removed from his government position and sent to work directly with rural communities, where he could use his skills to help the people he had once believed in so fiercely. It wasn't a punishment, but a second chance, a chance for Amadou to redeem himself and prove that he still had a place in the future of Burkina Faso. The room was silent as the ministers absorbed what Traoré had said. Some of them, especially the younger officers, seemed to support the idea of a more compassionate approach. Others, however, were visibly uneasy. There were risks, after all, in showing mercy to a man who had conspired against the government. But Traoré had made his choice, and he was resolute. "I will announce this decision publicly," Traoré said, his voice firm. "But I also ask for your support in this decision. We are not just rebuilding a government, we are rebuilding a country. And that requires compassion, not just strength." The ministers exchanged uncertain glances. There was a mixture of approval and skepticism in the air. Some felt that the decision was too lenient, that Traoré was taking a dangerous risk by showing mercy. Others, however, recognized that this was a defining moment, a moment when true leadership would be tested. Traoré wasn't just leading through power, he was leading through example. He wasn't blind to the political consequences of his decision, but he also knew that the future of the nation depended on his ability to rise above the cycles of vengeance and distrust. The decision was met with a mixture of relief and disbelief. The following day, Amadou appeared at the presidential palace to receive his new assignment. He was visibly embarrassed, but grateful for the opportunity to make amends for his mistakes. When he entered the palace's inner chamber, he kept his head low, avoiding the stares of the ministers and generals who had witnessed the previous day's meeting. He approached Traoré, his voice breaking with emotion. "Ibrahim," Amadou said quietly, "I don't know if I deserve your trust after what I've done." Traoré looked at him for a moment before placing a hand on his shoulder. "No one is automatically trustworthy, my brother, but everyone deserves a chance to prove themselves again." Amadou nodded, his face still heavy with the weight of his actions. Traoré had shown mercy, but Amadou knew that it wasn't a free pass. His actions from this point forward would determine his future, both in terms of his relationship with Traoré and with the people of Burkina Faso. That afternoon, as Amadou left the palace to begin his new role in rural development, Traoré reflected on his decision. It was a moment of personal growth, not just for Amadou, but for him as well. He had taken a risk, one that could have easily backfired. But he had chosen the harder path, the path that led toward reconciliation rather than division. As the day wore on, Traoré continued to face the burden of leadership. Decisions like these were not black and white. They were messy, complex, and often required an incredible amount of personal courage. Traoré knew that he would be questioned, both by his critics and by his supporters. There would be whispers in the halls of power, doubts about whether he had made the right call. But he also knew that he couldn't lead through fear. To lead effectively, he had to trust in the potential for growth and change, not just in his people, but in himself. Later that evening, Traoré walked alone through the palace gardens. The stars above glistened, but his mind was troubled. The weight of the choices he had made, the risks he had taken, pressed heavily on his shoulders. How could he lead his people if he couldn't forgive his own brother? That question echoed in his mind as he walked silently through the gardens, reflecting on the personal and political challenges he faced. Marie appeared from behind the bushes, carrying a cup of hot tea. She handed it to him gently, looking at him with concern in her eyes. "Mr. President," she said softly, "you look tired. Can I help you with anything?" Traoré smiled, appreciating her presence. "Marie," he said, his voice tired but thoughtful, "do you ever feel like doing what's right is harder than doing what's easy?" Marie nodded, understanding the depth of his question. "Yes, sir, but that's exactly why people trust you. Because you take the hard way when necessary." He sighed, a little lighter for having shared his thoughts. "I hope you're right, Marie. I hope you're right." With that, the night fell into a silence that seemed to offer a brief reprieve from the weight of leadership. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, but for tonight, Traoré found solace in the quiet certainty that he had made the right decision, even if it wasn't the easiest one.